Every October, the trucks line up before sunrise, diesel engines idling in the cold, steam rising off the backs of cattle. The regional auction yard in eastern Montana is the heartbeat of the county, the place where a rancher's whole year gets decided in the span of a few minutes under fluorescent lights. By mid-morning, most of the healthy calves are gone, loaded, sold, rolling down gravel roads toward feedlots in 3 different states. But one pen remains, 80 calves, ribs pressing against dull, dusty hide, noses running, a wet, rattling cough moving through the group like a warning. Nobody wants to get close enough to look twice. The auctioneer's voice slows, the price drops again. Buyers shake their heads and walk toward the coffee stand. Not worth the risk, one mutters. And then, from the back of the crowd, a young woman in a faded brown jacket walks quietly toward the office. She doesn't say much. She counts out the money in her hand, nearly all of it, everything she has left in the world, and sets it on the counter. Somebody laughs. She just paid for 80 graves. She doesn't answer. She picks up the receipt, folds it once, and puts it in her jacket pocket next to a small, weathered notebook. Why would anyone risk everything on 80 calves that everyone else had already given up on? Stay with us, because if you've ever believed something worth saving deserves one more chance, this story is for you. And before we go further, hit subscribe now, because what this young woman built by the end of this story is something most ranchers spend a lifetime chasing. Her name is Emily Dawson, 21 years old. Quiet in the way people are when they've spent more time listening to land than to people. 6 months earlier, she'd buried her grandfather on a hill behind the house, under a lone cottonwood that had stood there longer than the fences. He'd left her the ranch, 900 acres of native grass prairie, an old set of wooden corrals silvered by decades of wind, a windmill that still turned but groaned like it remembered better days, and a house with a leaking roof and a woman inside it who needed looking after. That woman was her grandmother, Margaret Dawson, 82 years old, calm in a way that made the world feel steadier. She didn't say much, but when she did, people listened. Your grandfather always said the land tells you the truth, Margaret told her one evening, hands wrapped around a coffee cup. Whether you want to hear it or not. The ranch was struggling. The bank account was thinner than the winter grass. Emily had been turning over every option, selling off pasture, leasing ground to a neighbor, giving up entirely. When she heard about the auction, 80 calves, unsellable, shipping fever moving through the pen. Buyers wouldn't touch them. The price kept falling until it was almost nothing. Almost nothing was exactly what Emily had. At the yard, she ran into Jack Turner, a respected cattle rancher 2 sections over, a man who'd built his herd the hard way and had opinions about anyone who hadn't done the same. "You're not seriously bidding on those," he said, arms crossed, watching her from beneath his hat brim. "I am." "They're sick, Emily. Half of them won't make it to spring." "Maybe," she said, "but somebody has to try." He shook his head and walked away, the kind of walk that says, "I already know how this ends." She bought all 80, loaded them herself, one shaky calf at a time, into a trailer that had seen better decades, drove them home under a sky-bruised purple with an early winter coming on. The first week nearly broke her. Shipping fever hit hard, that brutal respiratory sickness that spreads through stressed, hauled cattle like wildfire through dry grass. Calves standing hunched, heads low, breathing in short, rattling gasps. Dehydration sunk their eyes. Parasites had already stripped what little body condition they had left. The old water tanks froze overnight. Fences meant to hold healthy stock gave way under animals too weak to be pushed anywhere. Emily barely slept. She moved from pen to pen with a headlamp and a thermos of black coffee, checking respiration rates, counting how many were eating, noting which ones stood apart from the herd. A quiet sign. In cattle, that something is wrong before it becomes obvious. She wrote all of it down. The notebook had been her grandfather's gift to her, dark green, cracked at the spine, the kind you buy at a farm supply store and never expect to matter this much. She recorded everything: weights, feed intake, water consumption, respiration counts, weather, medicine given, pasture condition, every failure, every small improvement. It became the only thing that made sense in those first weeks. That's when she met Dr. Samuel Reed. He was 74, retired from 30 years of large animal veterinary practice, the kind of man who'd seen every disease a cow could carry and had stopped being impressed by any of it. Margaret had called him, an old friend of her late husband's, and he showed up in a beat-up truck with a bag of instruments and absolutely no interest in doing the work for her. "What are the calves telling you?" he asked, standing at the fence line, watching instead of touching. "That they're sick," Emily said. "That's what you're telling yourself. What are they telling you?" She looked again, really looked. The calves coughing worst were bunched near the north corner, out of the wind but standing in mud. The ones eating best had access to the driest ground. "They're telling me where they feel safe," she said slowly. "Now you're listening." He never gave her the answers. He asked the questions that made her find them herself. What changes when stress goes down? What happens in the hours before an animal gets sick, not after? Slowly, painfully, she began adjusting things. Better drainage, windbreaks made from old fence panels, feed timed to reduce competition and stress at the bunk. Some calves still died, not many, but enough that she cried in the barn more than once, kneeling beside an animal she couldn't save, writing the loss down in the notebook because her grandfather had taught her that even failure deserves to be recorded honestly. If you've ever poured everything you had into something and still watched part of it slip away, tell us in the comments. Where are you watching this from tonight? And have you ever been in a situation like Emily's? Winter tightened its grip. A late blizzard buried the ranch roads for 4 days. The tractor broke down hauling hay, and there was no money to fix it properly, so Emily rigged a temporary fix with wire and stubbornness. Hay grew scarce. Bills piled on the kitchen table faster than the calves gained weight. And through it all, Jack Turner watched from a distance. Not maliciously at first, just skeptically. But as weeks passed and word got around the county that the Dawson girl was pouring everything into a doomed herd, his skepticism hardened into something quieter and more damaging. A word here to the feed supplier, a comment there to a buyer who might have given her a fair price. He believed, genuinely, that she was ruining herself, and in his own way, he thought pushing her toward giving up sooner was a kindness. Emily nearly did give up. One February night, with the wind screaming against the windows and 3 calves down with pneumonia, she sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. Margaret set a hand on her shoulder. "Your grandfather never said this land was easy," she said. "He said it was honest. That's different." It was Margaret who remembered the loft. Up in the old barn, under decades of dust and swallow nests, Emily found a stack of her grandfather's journals, 30 years of handwritten notes on native grasses, rotational grazing, mineral-rich pasture pockets he'd mapped by hand, water movement across the property, seasonal recovery patterns he'd tracked before most ranchers in the region even used the term regenerative grazing. She sat in that loft until the light went grey outside, reading by lantern. The ranch hadn't been poor. It had been overgrazed. The same pastures worked too hard, too long, without the rest the land needed to rebuild itself. Her grandfather had known the fix. He just hadn't lived long enough to apply it. Emily began making changes that spring. Portable electric fencing to divide pastures into smaller paddocks. Rotational grazing that gave each section of grass real recovery time instead of being chewed down to bare dirt. Mineral supplementation matched to what the soil in each pasture actually lacked. Lower stress handling, quieter movements, less pressure. Calves allowed to settle before being moved. None of it was flashy. All of it was work. But the grass started coming back thicker, deeper rooted, more resilient than it had been in a decade. By midsummer, a drought settled over the region that hadn't been seen in 20 years. Creeks that always ran now sat as cracked mud. Neighboring ranches, grazed hard for years with no rest, saw their pastures collapse first. Ranchers began selling cattle early, at a loss, because there simply wasn't enough grass left to carry a herd through fall. Emily's pasture kept producing, not because of luck, because the ground had been given the chance to build the kind of root systems that hold moisture and recover fast. Exactly what her grandfather's journals had described 30 years earlier. Her 80 calves, once left for dead in an auction pen, were now thick-coated, alert, moving in a tight, calm herd across grass that neighboring ranchers no longer had. People started driving out just to see it, and one afternoon, a familiar truck came down the gravel road. Jack Turner stepped out slowly, hat in hand, looking at pasture that should have been dust by every measure he understood, and wasn't. He didn't say much. He never did. "I was wrong," he said finally, turning the hat over in his hands. Emily didn't gloat. She just nodded, the way her grandfather used to, and said, "The land was just waiting for someone to listen to it." Years later, the Dawson Ranch is one of the healthiest cow-calf operations in the county. Young ranchers drive out to walk the pastures with Emily. Veterinary students tour the property to see rotational grazing done by hand, built from nothing but 2 notebooks, one old, one new, now sitting side by side on the same kitchen shelf. Margaret still makes the coffee. Dr. Reed still asks more questions than he answers. And somewhere out on that prairie, 80 calves that nobody believed in became the foundation of something nobody can ignore. Sometimes, the strongest herd doesn't begin with the healthiest calves. Sometimes, it begins with someone willing to see life where everyone else only saw loss. If this story moved you, make sure you're subscribed to the Farmland Files. We tell real, honest stories about the people who keep American agriculture alive. And before you go, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever had to fight for something everyone else had already given up on.